Notice of motion number 2, Ms Webb to move that the Office of the Custodial Inspector Tasmania Annual Report 2022-2023 be considered and noted.
The Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I seek to move the motion standing in my name, order of the day number 2, which reads that the Office of the Custodial Inspector Tasmania Annual Report 2022-2023 be considered and noted. To commence, I think it is useful to place today's debate on this motion into some contextual timeframe, particularly for members who have recently joined us in this chamber. I initially tabled this motion on the 16th of November last year, shortly after the annual report 2022-2023 was tabled on the 18th of October. At that stage, there were no further private members' times scheduled for the 2023 parliamentary schedule, and my intention was to seek to have this debate when the Parliament resumed in March this year. However, as we all know, government was in the midst of an early election then, hence the delay until now. Which then also raises the question, Mr President, why bother considering, debating and noting a 2022-23 annual report when in a couple of months, presumably we'll have the more current 2023-2024 annual report tabled and at our disposal? The short answer, Mr President, is to ignore the Custodial Inspector's annual report 2022-23 would be a wasted opportunity. There are many lessons to be learned contained in this report. Given the time constraints today, I'll use my contribution to focus upon the range of recommendations made in the report, along with some of the key public policy observations also contained in the annual report. However, I first also need to acknowledge briefly that since the October tabling of the 22-23 annual report, the Custodial Inspector's Office has been busy releasing additional reports, specifically the recent Youth Wellbeing Inspection Report 2024, Inspection of Youth Custodial Services in Tasmania, dated June 2024 and published on the 25th of July this year. Also, the Youth Healthcare Inspection Report 2023, Inspection of Youth Custodial Services in Tasmania, dated December 2023, published on the 18th of July 2024. And the Adult Healthcare Inspection Report 2023, Inspection of Adult Custodial Services in Tasmania, also published on the 18th of July this year. And although, Mr President, it's tempting to discuss these 3 additional reports in detail as well, I won't be veering too much into that territory. Suffice to say, a key theme spanning the inspections informing those subsequent reports is the impact of lockdowns. And although it's beyond the scope of today's motion and today's time constraints to go into the details of those subsequent reports, I will in the main then keep my focus on the annual report that we are noting, 2022-2023. Mr President, although it's not a recommendation as such in the annual report, it does highlight on page 34 a significant matter of concern: the use of a dry cell by the Tasmanian Prison Service, TPS, in a manner that again contravenes the UN standard of minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners, the Nelson Mandela rules. The annual report states specifically that the cell was lit 24 hours a day and that prisoners could be held there for up to 72 hours or longer. The cell had no window to outside. Of specific concern is the inspectorate then, and I quote, confirmed that prisoners had been held knowingly in these conditions. This, Mr President, is a human rights breach and it wasn't accidental. It does indicate lack of awareness of those international conventions of which Australia is a signatory, or a cavalier attitude of potentially just not caring enough to comply with those conventions. I note that the Office of the Custodial Inspectorate undertook to report further on this issue and in further detail at a later date, which, as it happens, is today, with the scheduled tabling, and we've seen the tabling of the Inhumane Treatment in Dry Cells Review Report 2024. Unfortunately, I'll be unable to attend the Inspectorate's briefing today at lunchtime because I'll be attending a Joint Standing Committee on Integrity meeting. However, I'll speak more about that committee in a minute. Mr President, I did mention earlier that there were lessons to be learned from this annual report that we're noting today. A key lesson is using the lens of the public interest to inform decision-making, and just as importantly, reporting without fear or favour to responsible authorities and publicly. Members here would be aware there is a growing community and stakeholder movement, for want of a better word, advocating for strengthening Tasmania's democracy and good governance culture and architecture. During stakeholder roundtables and public forums in which I've attended and participated over recent months, an emerging theme is frustration regarding robust public interest ethos missing from the core of much of recent policy determinants and decision making. As the annual report points out, the public interest is central to the Office of the Custodial Inspector's mandate under the provisions of its Custodial Inspector Act 2016. As stated on page 8 of the report, and I quote, "When performing their functions, the inspector must act independently, impartially and in the public interest." Alarmingly, at times it does appear there is little interest in ensuring the public interest is central in matters of custodial detention, and particularly children and youth in detention. Mr. President, a key component of the 2022-23 annual report which caught my attention is section 6.6, beginning on page 30 of the report, regarding the age of criminal responsibility in Tasmania. For the benefit of those yet to read the annual report, it states, and I quote, "My mandate is to provide independent, proactive, preventative and systemic oversight of custodial centres. In the context of providing preventative oversight, I share the view of the Committee on the Rights of the Child that children under the age of 16 should not be in custodial centres, and in line with my mandate, I welcome the announcement that the Tasmanian Government is progressing towards this by raising the minimum age of detention to 14. It seems it is only a matter of time until the age of criminal responsibility will also rise from the current age of 10. The reasons for doing so are sound, but the actions and supports required to implement it are many." The report then goes on to cite the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, detailing children's rights in the child justice system, which also articulates why change is necessary. I'll not read that out now, but I will reiterate the Inspector's annual report's observation that by 2019, over 50 state parties had raised the minimum age following ratification of the Convention of the Rights of the Child, with the most common minimum age of criminal responsibility internationally at 14. The Custodial Inspector then issues a pretty blunt statement, Mr. President. He says, "There are sound reasons as to why Tasmania should follow suit to at least 14 years without exceptions for more serious crimes." Clearly, within the context of the Custodial Inspector's legislated mandate to provide independent, proactive, preventative and systemic oversight of custodial centres, and in the context of providing that preventative oversight, the Custodial Inspector is urging quite powerfully this important public policy change. It is worth pointing out this is also consistent with applying a human rights framework, which again underpins many of the statutes and international conventions which provide the scaffolding in which the Office of the Custodial Inspector must operate. I also note here, Mr. President, that this chamber gave consideration to this issue and in October 2021 supported my motion which called on the government to raise the age of criminal responsibility in the state to 14 years. We are left wondering when this government will catch up with the strong calls made for this evidence-based reform, given those calls are resoundingly coming from multiple statutory officers in this state, civil society, academia and this parliament. I mentioned statutes, Mr. President, and the majority of the clear recommendations contained in the annual report detail necessary changes to the Custodial Inspector Act 2016. It's disturbing to note that, as required under Section 26 of the Custodial Inspector Act 2016, recommendations for amendments were contained in earlier annual reports for 2020-21 and 2021-22, but have not been actioned by government. These contain recommendations to amend the Act to allow the Inspector to directly table inspection reports, as it is fitting for an independent statutory officer holder to do, rather than to go through the Minister. Also, to reduce the current 30-day embargo period that follows the 28-day departmental consultation stage on reports, which is currently resulting in inspection reports not being tabled for at least 2 months following finalisation. This is pretty extraordinary. How is a 2-month delay period before inspection reports are published in the public interest, I ask, Mr. President? A crucial recommendation highlighted in the current annual report is the need to provide protections for people who come forward to report issues to the Custodial Inspectorate. This isn't even a matter of strengthening protections, Mr. President. The report states unequivocally, and I quote from page 19, There are no protection for people who do come forward to report issues to my office. There should be. Absolutely, there should be, Mr. President, and I think most Tasmanians would be shocked to learn that such presumed protection is non-existent. This is an example of the woeful inadequacy of Tasmania's whistleblower laws and protections. I could discuss the need for urgent reform of the Public Interest Disclosure Act 2002 in great depth. However, I'll leave that in-depth debate for another day. But I will point out is that the point being made here by the Custodial Inspectorate highlights a significant flaw in our Public Interest Disclosure Act in its limited definition and application of a protected disclosure. Basically, according to the Custodial Inspector annual report, despite being an independent statutory oversight body with a mandate to act in the public interest, that office is not recognised as a defined recipient of protected disclosures made by external persons, even if they relate specifically to the core functions of the Custodial Inspector. Fortunately, the annual report provides details on how to rectify this problem by highlighting the appropriate model already legislated in our OPCAT Implementation Act 2021. Hence, it's a little surprising and disappointing that nowhere yet have I heard in the Attorney-General's Law Reform Program an amendment bill to the Custodial Inspector Act to provide these necessary protections in the public interest. Hopefully the government will be in a position to provide for us today an update on its response to this call from the Custodial Inspector. Mr. President, there are further recommended amendments to resolve discrepancies between the Youth Justice Act 1997 and the Custodial Inspector Act 2016 to provide consistent access to places of detention, the protection of correspondence for detainees and prisoners, and the creation of regulations facilitating delegation of the inspector's functions and powers to allow Custodial Inspectorate employed consultants to enter facilities at any time. In principle, these recommendations appear sensible and would enhance the capacity of the Custodial Inspector's Office to fully meet its legislated mandate. At least they should eventuate into amendment bills that would facilitate a broader debate and analysis of the merits or ramifications of such proposals. Mr. President, I wish to touch briefly on the issue of funding, that perennial area of complaint when it comes to our statutory officers, it seems. The report details its resourcing and constraints that apply to the office and the inspectorate team to fulfil their obligations as stipulated under statute. Such limitations imposed by resourcing shortages are always worrying. However, in this instance, it is of further concern, given the fact, as detailed in the report across pages 8 and 9, the Premier specifically stated in relation to AYDC on the 6th of September 2022, almost 2 years ago, that, and I quote, "Discussions have commenced with the Custodial Inspector regarding additional support to enable robust oversight and real-time feedback." The government sought the Custodial Inspector's team to increase its AYDC presence to at least multiple visits per month. However, the Inspector states, and I quote, "Currently, I have the capacity to conduct up to a maximum of 4 inspections a year and ad hoc visits when resourcing permits." Further, despite more discussions with the Department of Education, Children and Young People regarding additional support, no resolution was achieved, with apparently those same resourcing discussions continuing throughout 2023-24 reporting year. This tells us, Mr. President, that despite the government requesting in 2022 the Custodial Inspectorate team increase their visits and presence at AYDC to at least multiple visits per month, resourcing of that same office only facilitates 4 visits per year, nowhere near the multi-monthly calendar. So I've marked that spot, Mr. President, and I'll be looking for a real and tangible update in the forthcoming 2023-24 annual report to see whether and how this discrepancy has been addressed. Before I leave the report's recommendations, I will use this opportunity to specifically request from the government an update regarding whether and how it intends to act upon these outstanding recommendations spanning the Custodial Inspector's last 3 annual reports, including the one we're noting today. I hope the government's contribution today provides us with that update on whether it has accepted these following recommendations: to provide the Custodial Inspector the capacity to table inspection and other reports directly to Parliament, to reduce the current 30 days embargo, additional to the 28-day consultation stage provided for departments prior to the publishing of reports, and to resolve the perception of inspectorate staff being Department of Justice employees by changing employment arrangements to a department which has no direct responsibility for prison services or youth justice. Additionally, Mr President, I'll be keen to hear from the government of further action taken to do the following: to address the identified matter of AYDC detainees requiring restricted mobile phones with pre-programmed family and oversight entity numbers, young people in the TPS accessing the Common Auto Dial List, or CADL, should have automatic access to all appropriate oversight bodies and relevant legal services. I also note the reports point that similarly those same oversight bodies and other services should also be made aware proactively by government that those entities can request to have their phone numbers provided to detainees via the CADL. I hope the government's able to provide an update today on that. Here there seems to have been confusion between the Office of the Custodial Inspector and the opportunities to be on that CADL function for detainees. I'm also interested to hear whether further action has been taken on the matter raised about ensuring that remandees and prisoners sentenced to less than 3 years and thus being eligible to vote, whether they have appropriate access to election materials and voting facilities. Another area I'd like to have an update on further action about is about the provision of greater support for Aboriginal detainees and prisoners. This is an urgent requirement that was also highlighted in not just the annual reports of recent years, but also the subsequent wellbeing and health reports that have come out more recently. Mr President, I also note on page 18 of the report the fact that unlike the Department of Justice, which has undertaken to provide annual updates on progress made on any custodial inspector recommendations received, the Inspectorate was unaware of similar undertakings being made by either the Department of Health or the Department of Education, Children and Young People. This is concerning, particularly given the Department of Education, Children and Young People is responsible for AYDC. So again, I hope the government is in a position to reassure us on that front today that similar updates on progress are provided across all relevant departments in regards to the recommendations made in the annual reports. Mr President, it is also worth noting, I think, that when reading the annual report 2022-23, I was struck by the lack of reference to and the apparent lack of involvement with civil society. It's clear that the team from the Custodial Inspector's Office have undertaken some rigorous and impressive professional development, utilising the skills and expertise of interstate and international peers and counterparts from the ACT, Western Australia and the UK National Preventative Mechanism, the NPM. And this is laudable. However, I was a little surprised to see that the list of primary and other stakeholders, detailed on pages 12 and 13 of the annual report, were heavy on government departments, other statutory officers, but silent on any NGO or community service providers or other civil society groups. A specific example is the mention on page 13 of, and I quote, the manager of the Prison Official Visitors Program, a reference which appears to omit consideration of the actual participating official visitors as fellow stakeholders and potentially expertise and observations and insight, potentially with expertise, observations and insights worthy of consideration. Given the commentary elsewhere throughout the annual report of the limited funding and resourcing for the Custodial Inspectorate Office, particularly in light of its mandated 3-yearly facility inspection cycle, it would be a logical assumption that there was greater integration and involvement and utilisation of the skills and experiences of the NGO and service provider sector. For example, members would recall in October last year, TASCOS and a coalition of justice and social service organisations, including the Prisoners Legal Service Tasmania and 54 Reasons, called on the Premier to demonstrate his stated commitment to the safety of our children by closing Ashley Youth Detention Centre as a matter of urgency and working with the community services industry around progressing alternative arrangements. These are also stakeholders, albeit on a different tier than formal members of the bureaucracy or other statutory entities, but I would expect there would be more recognition of the roles that they provide and the connections that they may well make with the Custodial Inspector's Office and its work. There may be a point worth exploring. This may be a point worth exploring further via the oversight mechanisms of the Joint Parliamentary Committee. The role of civil society is also pertinent when considering one of the key themes which emerges from a reading of this annual report. Other than the specific state legislation such as the Custodial Inspectors Act 2016 and the Youth Justices Act 1997, the OPCAT Implementation Act 2021, for example, there is continual reference to international treaties and conventions. These include the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment and Punishment, the Committee on the Rights of the Child, General Common number 24, 2019, on children's rights in the child justice system from 18 September 2019, the United Nations Standard Minimum Rules for the Treatment of Prisoners, the Nelson Mandela Rules. It's of grave concern that in most cases these international treaties are cited in the context that Tasmania may be in breach of them. This is even further concerning when, to be blunt, that means we are in breach of conventions against torture and other cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment or punishment of children, Mr. President. That is a huge red flag this annual report has been waving at us since October last year. And in fact, the reports from the year before that and the year before that and no doubt the year before that. For those who may not have had a chance to read this annual report closely, I wish to draw the Chamber's attention to section 6.1, which begins on page 25 of the report. Key observations to do with the use of lockdowns. I quote from the report: I have not previously observed lockdowns on a systemic level in youth detention in Tasmania, and it is a disturbing precedent. That statement in itself would be of sufficient concern to warrant Parliament to demand to know of the Minister what is going on. However, the report continues, and I quote, "It was the subject of negative comment by the United Nations Committee Against Torture in its concluding observations on the 6th Periodic Report of Australia with respect to the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment." It said on page 5, it said on 5th of December 2022, "The committee is seriously concerned about D, the practice of keeping children in solitary confinement, in particular at Ashley Youth Detention Centre in Tasmania, which contravenes the Convention and the Nelson Mandela Rules." Just to be clear, that was not the Custodial Inspector saying the conditions of AYDC at the time breached the UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment. That was the UN Committee Against Torture's finding. Even without the Commission of Inquiry's final report a month earlier, this should have been set alarm bells clanging. Statements such as this, basically stating Tasmania is in breach of international torture conventions, are not made lightly by our independent statutory officers, Mr. President. This is gravely shocking and deeply serious. And it is further mind-boggling that since this report was published last year, it has largely passed without comment, nor any apparent change in policy or practice from the government. How can that be? Have we really become so desensitised, so immured to the crises we lurch from over and over in our so-called youth justice system, that a deliberate and non-hyperbolic reference by a statutory oversight entity to a UN Committee Against Torture statement that we are in contravention of that convention receives a mere shrug of the shoulders? If that, what an indictment on us all, Mr. President. I acknowledge that more recently, such as on the 25th of July this year, the Custodial Inspector's Office has released statements identifying some improvements specifically at AYDC in areas such as engagement with the Tasmanian Aboriginal community and improved access to sport, recreation and nutritional food. While these are to be lauded and hopefully maintained into the future, it is important to note that the July media release still emphasised the ongoing and troubling high lockdown rates and other concerns such as the need for improved training and security provisions, particularly for visitors. So while improvements are to be welcome, there is clearly still a long way to go, and none of the points canvassed mitigate the ultimate need for the government to act on its commitment to close AYDC as soon as possible, which, as we all know, was an urgent recommendation of the Commission of Inquiry. Indeed, an urgent recommendation for which we are approaching the 12-month anniversary already, with little apparent progress in that time and no firm timeline committed to by the government. Mr. President, let us demonstrate unequivocally to the next visit by the UN Committee Against Torture, as there will be further visits under the OPCAT protocol, that we heard and heeded their alarming observation from last time, and let's have AYDC closed by that time, by the time the committee visits again, Mr President, which will inevitably be still too late for the children who are suffering in that place. We need to demonstrate that we have heard this bell tolling. The bell that tolls for Ashley Youth Detention Centre is our responsibility to respond to. To conclude, Mr President, it is also interesting and significant to note section 5.6 of the report on page 23, where the Custodial Inspector provides a polite rebuke to this Parliament. I quote, "The Custodial Inspector has a significant range of powers, and it is important that my office and I are subject to effective oversight." How refreshing, Mr President. So often we are in a tug-of-war with those who resist effective oversight and accountability. Here we have an independent authority requesting more of it. The report comments on the fact there appears to be no evidence that Custodial Inspector reports have been considered, particularly by the Joint Standing Committee on Integrity, which is specifically charged with monitoring and reviewing the performance of functions of an integrity entity, which the Office of the Custodial Inspector is. I believe that may be in the process of changing, which I'm certainly keen to pursue as a new member of that committee. And I reiterate my request to hear from the government in response regarding to its plans to address recommendations contained in the Office of the Custodial Inspector Annual Report 2022-23. I'm sure the government will want to focus on the more recent media statements which praise some improvements. However, none of those identified many improvements provide a systematic response framework to the things that have been raised again and again, and they certainly do not negate the outstanding and unaddressed recommendations detailed in this annual report. To summarise, the specific recommendations of interest from the report are legislative action taken to provide protections for people who report or raise issues with the Custodial Inspector's Office. Action to enhance the independence of the Custodial Inspector's Office, such as providing for direct tabling of inspection reports in a more timely manner, as well as resolving issues of non-independence perceptions due to employment under the Department of Justice. Resolving access and other confidentiality inconsistencies between the Youth Justice Act and the Custodial Inspectors Act. Further legislative reforms, including improved access to independent oversight entities and legal services for detainees and prisoners, and greater support on the ground for Tasmanian Aboriginal detainees. Hopefully, Mr President, the government's response will be sufficiently thorough and swift that the next annual report, expected within the next couple of months, can contain a meaningful update and progress report instead of being stuck on repeat. I also acknowledge and take note of the gentle, if somewhat exasperated, prod also contained in the annual report before us, that up until now, the Joint Integrity Committee appears to have ignored one of the statutory regulatory entities within its remit. As a new member of that Joint Parliamentary Committee, I accept my share of responsibility to ensure it is more inclusive in this regard, and I would imagine my fellow committee members would feel the same. Yep. It would be quite a remarkable turnaround in light of the series of earlier annual reports, should the Office of the Custodial Inspector not feel the need to copy and paste from this 2022-2023 annual report to the forthcoming document because those matters remained unaddressed or outstanding? I certainly hope not, Mr President. It should be apparent what an integral role the statutory role of the Custodial Inspector's Office should play in providing Tasmania's independent oversight of and ensuring the protection of those Tasmanians who spend the slightest amount of time in custodial facilities, particularly in this time of heightened awareness following the Commission of Inquiry process and final report. In that context, Mr President, I do hope that today's debate is the beginning of this place continuing to consider the range of work undertaken and reports provided by the Office of the Custodial Inspector in a more systematic and rigorous manner, that we continue to consider and weave into our related legislative debate and policy reviews consideration of this and other statutory entities as appropriate. To go full circle, that is, utilising the public interest lens and placing the public interest at the core of the scrutiny, transparency and accountability that we are responsible for in this place. To be frank, that is the bare minimum of what we should be doing with any annual report stipulated to be tabled in this place, let alone in this instance where the Section 26 of the Custodial Inspector Act 2016 legally requires the Inspector's Office to include in its annual report an evaluation of the response of the relevant authorities to the recommendations of the Inspector, and any recommendation for changes in the laws of the state or for the administrative action that the Inspector considers should be made as a result of the performance of the Inspector's functions. Certainly, the Inspector's Office do report to us, Mr President. They are required to report to this Parliament. It is then incumbent on the Parliament to pay attention, to listen, and most importantly, to act. Having said that, I do acknowledge we have tabled reports and documents coming at us at a fast rate of knots, particularly during the final sitting weeks of October. So I do include myself in that reminder, and I know we will all put our shoulder to the wheel. Finally, I wish to also acknowledge, while I'm here speaking about this annual report, I wish to acknowledge and thank the team of the Office of the Custodial Inspector Tasmania for their diligence and their patient persistence for the Parliament to pay attention to its yearly findings and recommendations. I thank them for their work. It's important work, and I want them to know that we will be listening and that we will be undertaking our function as they report to us. I note the Custodial Inspection Annual Report 2022 to 2023.